Hello again. Welcome to ASPI's Strategic Vision 2020. I'm Stan Grant. Remember at the end of last year when the headlines were not about COVID-19, the headlines globally were about the bushfires, the summer bushfires in Australia, catastrophic bushfires, among the worst we have ever seen, that captured headlines around the world and really became a focal point for renewed discussion about the impact of climate change, extreme weather events such as bushfires. To what extent was climate change a factor in that? It seemed to be one of those cathartic moments where we are jolted into a new reality. Then, of course, came coronavirus, and climate change as an issue has probably disappeared largely from our headlines, but it hasn't gone away. And there is an intersection between the issues of coronavirus and how we deal with climate change. And that goes to our governance, our global politics, the capacity for countries to work together, and how we deal with an increasing virulent nationalism in the world, which is challenging that global order and that cooperation which is necessary to deal with either global pandemics or existential issues such as climate change. This cuts across all areas of policy. It is also a deeply ideological issue, and we're seeing issues of climate change play a decisive role in the outcomes of elections here and also throughout the rest of the world. We're going to be discussing the issue of climate change, its immediate impacts, what we do to mitigate, how do we achieve the best policy outcomes, how do we work together as a globe to be able to deal with the challenge of climate change, and of course its convergence with the issues of coronavirus. Joining us today will be Christiana Figueres, the Costa Rican diplomat, former Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and of course a widely published author. We are just waiting now to hear from Christiana. Having some technical issues, she should be here shortly. Also with us is Robert Glasser, former head of the UN Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General and a visiting fellow here at ASPI. Robert, until we get Christiana, we'll have to soldier on. I wanted to start with you because you've dealt with this issue of disaster risk management and how we mitigate these disasters and extreme weather events. What did the bushfires teach us about that?
Well, I think we learned a few things about bushfires. First of all, we learned the point you made earlier, that there's a connection between climate change and the outbreak of bushfires. We've seen unprecedented drought, very high temperatures, and how those factors can contribute to outbreaks of bushfires and the intensity of bushfires. So that's one thing we've learned from the bushfire season. The second thing we've learned is that with climate change, we are now seeing hazards that are triggering other hazards and together having enormous cascading impacts on society. So we saw this with the scale of the bushfires, first of all. The bushfire disaster very quickly becoming a biodiversity disaster, becoming a disaster for tourism in Australia, becoming a health disaster as well in terms of the air quality that many Canberra, Sydney, and other cities experienced during the fires. So you have these examples now of the scale of the disasters increasing and their cascading impacts on society.
Hey, Christiana has just joined us now. It's nice to see you there, Christiana. We'll come to you. It's good to have you with us. We'll come to you in just a moment. Robert, I'll just follow up. We began, Christiana, with a discussion about the bushfires and what a moment that was and what it told us about climate change and how urgent the issues are. Robert, when you have an event like that, it very quickly becomes, in some ways, a polarizing event as well. And immediately there is a debate about the extent to which climate change is a factor or a contributing factor. And people like to point out that, yes, we've had these things in the past. There have been bushfires in the past. There have been droughts in the past, that the warnings of catastrophe are overblown, that this isn't just about climate change. It's about fire management, land management, a whole lot of other issues. To what extent were you able to look at an event like that and say, yes, this is about, it does have something to do with the impact of the changing climate?
Well, the first thing is those comments are partially correct, that it's not just climate change. It's a whole range of factors, including how we manage forests. But fundamentally, the science, CSIRO, our National Science Institution, has looked at this and has said clearly there's a link to climate change. The government has acknowledged this. So there's clearly a climate signal in this event. There's a climate signal now that's being identified in events all over the world, including the unprecedented heat wave in Siberia and the fires that have broken out, in the past months. So yes, there's a very clear connection to climate change, and scientists tell us, the science tells us, that we will see more of these events, and the scale of them will be unprecedented. We've had record-setting temperatures, we've had record droughts. We are a sunburned country that experiences droughts and floods and have done for ages. The scale of these hazards is becoming enormous and unprecedented.
Christiana, what did you think when you were watching from afar the events at the end of 2019, the summer of Australia, and the bushfires that really did capture headlines throughout the world?
They really did. I wasn't in Australia then. I came later at the end of January, beginning of February. And so, and unfortunately, I had to leave very early because of COVID, and I had to make it home quickly. I wasn't able in my January/February trip to have enough time to talk to enough Australians about how they perceived and experienced the fires. What I can say is that the fires seared into the soul of all of us who were watching this. As we have just heard, those fires were not caused by climate change, but they were definitely amplified by climate change. And that's the difference that we have to understand. All of these natural events, tornadoes, floods, they're not caused at the small scale. They're not caused by climate change. They are at their root, let's call them natural events. But the scale and the intensity and the frequency with which we are being pounded is definitely due to climate change. So climate change has to be understood as an amplifier of all of these natural disasters. The fires in Australia were absolutely, as I say, searing into the soul of so many of us because of the land area that burned, because of the animals that burned alive, because of the very delayed reaction of the government, and also because of the absolutely devoted, committed, amazing reaction of the firefighting force in Australia. It was so moving. It was so moving to see how they put their lives in danger in order to save the forest and the bush that was burning. So, for all of those reasons, I will never forget those fires in Australia. I hope no Australian will ever forget them.
Now, we have an increasing number of people joining this conversation. I welcome your questions and comments as well, and I'll try to reflect those questions and comments in the issues that we discussed with Christiana and Robert. Christiana, I just want to pursue something that you said there, and this becomes a very difficult message politically, and I think it feeds into what we could broadly describe as an ideological or cultural political war around the issues of climate and how those issues are played out in the public. And that is to the extent, as you said there, that these things are caused by climate or amplified by climate. And in that space, there is so much political point scoring.
In that space lies the problem, right? In that space lies the political problem. Because if we could say without any doubt, if scientists could say without any doubt, these events are caused. There is a direct cause effect. Well, we would be in a different space. But scientists have been very responsible. And they have said, you know, there have always been, in the case of bushfires, there have always been bushfires in Australia. So we can't say that bushfires in general are caused by climate change. That would be completely irresponsible and laughable. What we can say is that the scale, the depth, and the frequency is amplified by climate change. Now, frankly, we humans should have enough brains to be able to understand the difference between causality and amplification. And if we don't, it's because we don't want to. But we have plenty of examples in other areas that are not climate change in which we can differentiate between causality and amplification. And climate should not be an exception to that.
Robert, it should be clear, as Christiana says, but we know that politics increasingly in the world is being driven by division. And we've seen a rise of what we could call populist politics, which is really seized on issues. You've written about Brexit to the extent that that was driven by issues of climate change as well, in terms of shaping our politics. Is that why it is so difficult to achieve political consensus, get traction, to be able to develop policy in advance of events such as the bushfires, or to more effectively deal with the challenges in a coherent and consistent way?
I think we have to distinguish between the dust that's in the air currently as a result of COVID and the Trump presidency and the tensions with China. I realize there's some longer term trends there as well. But I think generally, if we look at the public opinion around the world, there's very strong support for climate action, for global climate action, and that support has been increasing. There are two caveats. One is that there is, in Australia and the US in particular, are the two countries that have the largest number of climate deniers in the public opinion surveys we've seen. And there's some particular political challenges in Australia and the coalition government, for example, that makes action harder on this issue. So I think there is populism, but as we've seen during Brexit, it was partly the climate-induced refugees in Europe that contributed to sentiment in the UK to leave the EU. And it's an example of how a global challenge, a systemic threat like climate change, is triggering these cascading impacts that really can only be addressed by acting multilaterally and globally, as with COVID.
Well, let's look specifically at... Yes, Christiana.
Jump on that point because it's such an important point, right? I totally agree that among other factors, again, not 100% causality, but among other factors, migration into Europe caused by many things, by wars, certainly by conflicts, but also by changing living conditions, i.e. climate change, was one of the factors that eventually led to Brexit. Now, here's the question that we should think about. How is putting our head in the sand about climate-induced migration going to help us deal with migration that is going to go up by a factor of 10, 100? How is that going to help? How is ignoring the problem and hoping it's going to go away, how is that contributing to solving the problem, or in fact, even to making any of our countries more secure and more stable? It doesn't. It simply doesn't. That is why we should, frankly, not tolerate the fact that climate change has become unreasonably politicized, because climate change has nothing to do with partisan politics. And it has to do with humanity's future. All of us, no matter what political party we actually ascribe to.
But it does have something to do with politics, Robert, because clearly there is political mileage to be gained. Why is there an appetite, if in the face of the reports that we have seen and the scientific consensus and evidence that we have seen, the events such as the bushfires, the longer, hotter summers that the world is experiencing, the extreme weather events that we see, why is there seemingly then an appetite among the public, and we see this reflected in elections and in opinion polls, for what could broadly be described as climate skepticism or denial or a lack of belief in the science? Why does that political message resonate?
I think it resonates partly because of the way the issue is framed by special interests in society, including this issue of the as if jobs in fossil fuel industries versus renewables, the threat to jobs. It's also key because there are clearly special interests that with a transition from fossil fuels to renewables are not particularly excited about that possibility. We've seen not just in Australia, but in the US, where there have been intense investments in lobbying to question the science around climate change. But I think, Stan, the important thing is that this will change. It already is changing very quickly. It's changing because of the scale of the disasters we're seeing now. If we hadn't, one of the reasons the Prime Minister initiated a Royal Commission inquiry into the bushfire disasters was, and included in the terms of reference of that commission, climate and climate adaptation and what Australia needs to do to build its resilience, was because climate change for this government and for the opposition as well is now becoming a big issue. With more frequent, enormous disasters, with these cascading impacts on society, the public opinion, the politics will change because the public will demand that.
But is there conversely, though, the other argument, Christiana, and as Robert identified, climate-induced refugees as being part of the backdrop of Brexit? We've also seen refugees as a result of conflict and war, which has also impacted the politics across Europe, and a political right that's ridden a wave of anti-refugee or anti-immigration sentiment. As we see increasing nationalism in the world, and as we do indeed see increasing numbers of people uprooted by changes in climate and looking for safe haven in other countries, doesn't it just feed into that resistance, the very resistance that we know that politicians have been preying upon, Christiana?
Well, I think there are two ways to look at this. The first, I referred to before, that ignoring the problem, running away from it, sticking our head in the sand doesn't solve the issue, and that if we want to have safer, more stable economies, we actually need to address climate change. That's the first level of an answer. The other level of an answer is to understand that actually, by and large, decarbonizing the economy of any country is actually a good thing to do independently of everyone else. It leads to a stronger economy. It leads to much more jobs. It leads to much more livable cities. It leads to more productive land. It leads to much more economic independence from imports of fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. So you could, if you want to, say, okay, I am not going to take any of the global needs on board, forget about the world, forget about everyone else. I only want to look at my own interests. Now, if you do that wisely, your conclusion is also going to be that decarbonizing your economy is actually a good thing to do in the 21st century. So whether you want to close your mental, frontiers and say, I'm only interested in what happens in my own country, or whether you want to see this and its broad manifestation, which is global, you finally come to the same conclusion.
Yes, Rob.
Can I just comment on that? I agree with what Christiana just said. I think it's really important for us in Australia to realize that Australia, unlike almost any other OECD country, finds itself in a region with many near neighbor less developed countries. And the fate of those countries will impact Australia's own national security very directly, including countries that you can swim to from Northern Australia, Papua New Guinea, for example, but Indonesia as well, one of the most populous, largest Islamic country in the world. Climate change is going to have huge disruptive impacts on those countries. And if we're talking about asylum seekers currently, if you imagine the impact this will have on food security in our region, in other countries using our region as a countries to our north as a transit point to Australia, it's just not a credible response to just put up walls and hope that that's going to stop that sort of response.
Yeah, I want to explore some of those issues you've raised, particularly the geopolitical implications of climate change and indeed defence and strategic implications as well. But you have raised the question, and you mentioned COVID before. I know once we start talking about COVID, it's so difficult to talk about anything else, but it is really relevant in this case. And Robert, you said there about borders and nationalism and being aware of your neighbours. Yet we are living through a moment in COVID-19 where our borders are shutting, and our borders are our salvation. Indeed, to stop people coming means to keep people alive. To what extent is that going to play into perhaps a more virulent sense of nationalism or a beggar thy neighbour approach, which may ultimately affect the way that we try to strike a cooperative and consensus-based approach to climate change policy?
Well, I think COVID, there are a number of lessons from COVID for climate change. One of them is that you can't ignore these emerging threats because ultimately dealing with them requires multilateral action outside of our countries. We saw we had much early, just as with climate change, a lot of early warning on pandemic. We had bird flu, we had swine flu, we had MERS, we had SARS. And in each of those cases, the scientists were telling us we needed to respond. And the response was incremental to the immediate outbreak, but not to address the longer term threat. With climate change, it's the same situation. We have warnings from science. We're now seeing the impacts. And I think it will be clear with climate change that we must respond to this globally. If Australia puts up walls, the climate is still going to warm, and the impacts on Australia, and they are particularly severe because of our geographic location, will overwhelm Australia, will overwhelm us. So there's no alternative but to work globally to deal with this threat. Any other option, walls don't work.
But Christiana,
I want to really emphasize, sorry, that point. Robert keeps on making such good points. Here's what we have to understand. Yes, putting up walls around our homes or around our countries has served us well in the short term. In the short term. But please point to one country that will survive economically if they continue to isolate themselves within their own walls. None. None. Everyone on this planet depends, in order to truly come out of the COVID economic crisis, we all depend on a vaccine. The vaccine is not going to be developed and certainly not produced or distributed on a country-by-country basis. That is ludicrous to think that. In order to truly address the COVID economic crisis, as well as the health crisis, the combination of the two, we have to go to global cooperation in order to be able to develop the vaccine in time, to produce as many as we need, 7 billion, and to distribute them. And only then will we be able to return, if we ever will, to some new normal. So thinking that building our walls is actually a sustainable forever solution to COVID, and certainly to the economic crisis, is completely inane. And let me use that adjective quite deliberately. That is just not a solution. We have to move forward into a much more collaborative space if we want to rescue our economies out of our own self-interest. Do we have to move toward collaboration?
Christiana, it's interesting that you raised the vaccine issue, because that is a good analogy. It's also, we're also seeing and hearing warnings of a vaccine nationalism, that people will hoard the vaccine. Countries, richer countries in particular, will look after themselves first. And that does play into the sort of debate we've seen around climate change, which is, I will put my country's interests first, economic interests, whatever that may be. And that impacts just precisely on what you're talking about, the cooperation that is necessary to reach a consensus-based approach that actually has an impact on reversing the changes to our climate. So it is so difficult to get a read, isn't it, on which way this may go, because vaccine nationalism, the impact of COVID may lead to those borders going back up again.
Well, but it's not so difficult to, figure out where this is going to go, because let's just play that scenario out. Okay, country X, whoever, decides that they develop the vaccine and they're going to develop as many vaccines as citizens they have, period. That's it. Okay. What's going to happen to the trade of that country with any other countries? They're not going to trade with anyone. They're not going to travel. They're not going to interact with the rest of the world. They're actually going to pretend like they're on, some secluded island. That doesn't make any sense. They will not be able to reach economic strength again unless they open themselves up mentally and logistically and politically and economically to the rest of the world. So it just doesn't make sense to continue to insist that the solution to a global problem, COVID or climate change, is actually putting up our borders and isolationist approach. It just doesn't make any sense when you think about it logically.
I think the question's framed in too much of a black and white way, because I think there will clearly be changes in the way we deal with pandemics going forward. I think the vaccine technology, countries that can afford it, will try and invest in their development of vaccine technologies. To do that effectively, they need to work with other countries, actually, even to do that, to share information like the genetic codes of the viruses that are circulating, and for disease surveillance in the countries that are experiencing outbreaks. Secondly, I think there'll be changes to critical supply chains. As an Australian, I think globally, but also as an Australian, I would like there to be personal protective equipment available. And I think a number of companies are looking at their supply chains through this crisis. And this does relate to the geopolitics with the tensions with China. And I think there'll be changes, of course, to critical supply chains as a response to this. The real question is, what is it that we can do nationally if I'm thinking nationally, what is it can we do that we need to do nationally to preserve our well-being? And if you ask that question about COVID, there are a range of things that we need to do, including many that require us to work internationally. If you ask that about climate change, we need to, of course, adapt to climate change, prepare for rising seas, more severe bushfires. But fundamentally, we can't solve this problem without engaging globally, let alone the security implications in our region.
Robert, to what extent, it's been an ongoing theme of our discussions throughout this Strategic Visions series, to what extent has COVID been an accelerator of the strains that already existed in our world politically, and a return of great power rivalry? We know in the lead up to COVID that tensions were ratcheting up between the United States and China, that the US had declared China a strategic competitor. There was a trade war playing out, and they've only accelerated, I think, throughout the COVID crisis. So to what extent is it having an impact on geopolitics and how that feeds back into dealing with issues of climate change?
I think it's interesting. First of all, I think there's some policy decisions in the US that have accelerated this competition. and changes in the international system that were unfolding as part of a trend, but would have unfolded over a much longer period of time. Secondly, I think neither the US nor China emerged from this looking particularly good. The US looks horribly flawed in both the response to the pandemic and the way that has contributed to the whole Black Lives Matter debate and the riots in cities. I think from the outside, and there have been some public opinion surveys that suggest this, the US does not look good in this example. China, on the other hand, in the midst of this tension, the crackdown on Hong Kong, there are a whole variety of things China has been doing also that has raised questions among observers in other countries. So I think the geopolitics, some of the issues in train are now, I'm afraid, they've accelerated the transition. Others, I think, if depending on how the politics evolves, the US election could be restored, or some of the tensions could be resolved.
Christiana, what are your thoughts on that? And let me add another thing in the lead up to COVID, but going back a couple of years, but it does feed into this sense of increasing nationalism and a great power rivalries. And that is the decision by Donald Trump to pull out of Paris.
Well, it is pretty lamentable, isn't it? It's lamentable that it's not. What is really lamentable is the lack of understanding behind that decision. I have to tell you, I was on travel when I heard the news that he was going to announce that he was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, just practically a few months after his election. And I thought, oh, this is going to be very interesting. And so I set the alarm. I sat in front of the TV screen with a piece of paper, primitively, and a pen. And I said, every time that there is one correct statement made, I'm going to write it down because this will be historic. I ended the speech with a blank piece of paper. So poorly informed about everything that has to do with the Paris Agreement, every single legal clause, every single political agreement there. Really very lamentable that the head of state of a country of such leadership as the United States was so poorly informed, or decided to be so poorly informed. Now, elections are on the 3rd of November, and the 4th of November is the first day in which the United States can legally withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And so anyway, no matter what happens on November 3, we are expecting that the US will withdraw from the Paris Agreement on the 4th of November because the paperwork is already ready, and certainly the political will is definitely ready for that. Having said that, two things. First, should President Trump not get reelected, a President Biden would be able to rejoin very quickly with the stroke of a pen, because that's the way it is foreseen in the Paris Agreement. And furthermore, he's already made very public that he would not just rejoin the Paris Agreement, but he already has all of his list of policy measures that he would undertake in order to bring the United States back into the 21st century on technology and on energy and on land use. But in the meantime, what is also very lamentable is that this lack of leadership in the White House on these issues has actually left a vacuum of leadership that has been filled in by China and to a certain extent by India, both of whom have invested incredibly over the past 3 to 4 years into solar energy, into wind energy, into charging stations, into electric vehicles, electric buses, because they know that that's their competitive edge. They know that those are the products and services that will be increasingly in high demand over the next 5 to 10 years. And they want to be in a position to A, produce them, and B, sell them. And so, you know, it's pretty lamentable that the United States has actually left that space open to China. Now, that's seen from the perspective of the federal government. If you go below the federal government, the fact is that the states on the East Coast and on the West Coast in general have actually, and more than 300 cities and thousands of corporations in the United States have continued to decarbonize because they understand that it is good for their bottom line. And you know, one of the fun things of the universe, because the universe has a lot of humor in it, is that the United States is one of the countries that has actually decarbonized most over the past 3 years, not because of policy, but just sheerly because of economics, because coal is no longer competitive. And so you see more and more coal plants closing because they simply cannot compete against renewables, and certainly not against natural gas. So, you know, all in all, a mixed picture for the United States.
That's really interesting, Robert, isn't it? Because as Christiana pointed out, that global leadership is important, and it's important to have that policy leadership within countries, and also the US is still the most powerful country in the world, to be able to set that example. But it's also interesting, isn't it, that not just other states in the US, but also business, that business has factored this in too. This is part of the business model now, irrespective, in a sense, of what government policy says.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Stan, because, and actually, Christiana, in Australia as well, all of the states and territories have now endorsed net zero by 2050. Our federal government hasn't yet done that. Hopefully it will soon. So I think it's both at subnational level and the private sector and the financial sector in particular, because we have some major initiatives underway on financial disclosure of climate risk. And that two elements of the risk. One is your business exposed to a transition away from fossil fuels? And what does that mean for the value of your business? And the second is, does your business own assets in places that are vulnerable to the hazards that climate change is accelerating? And over time, the physical risk, exactly. So over time, this is currently a voluntary reporting structure that affects trillions of dollars now in business around the world, but it will soon become a mandatory reporting with mandatory frameworks, so it can't not just be a tick the box exercise. And as that happens, it is going to redirect literally billions and billions of dollars globally away from carbon and away from vulnerable infrastructure. BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, is already detecting the climate signal in the costs of using sophisticated algorithms, AI algorithms, for infrastructure utilities, for example, where they're seeing that exposed utilities are a less attractive financial investment, and they're advising their clients now to move in different directions. So yeah, I think it's going to be a huge impact. That combined with the decreasing, just this unprecedented global transition, energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables will.
And to your question of corporations, it's fascinating to look at, you know, just a couple of recent examples. Amazon, not exactly a small company in the world, has undertaken a carbon neutrality pledge to be reached by 2040, which is 10 years earlier than the Paris Agreement. Microsoft and Apple have undertaken climate neutrality by 2030, which is 20 years earlier. They have, of course, a much easier carbon footprint to deal with than Amazon does, but still, someone like Amazon, which is honestly bigger than many national economies in the world and more complex than many economies in the world, truly undertaking a very bold commitment. Why? Because they understand, A, that customers expect this, so they're anticipating customer demand, and they also know that that carbon inefficiency in the end will cost them a lot of money. So they want to be carbon efficient in order to be responsible with their financial bottom line. And the latest, you know, very exciting announcement now, not from a US-based company, but rather from a British company, very exciting announcement from BP, British Petroleum, in which they just announced a couple of days ago that they're going to forego 40% of the oil and gas that they would have extracted, that is on their books to extract. 40% they're going to forego and leave it in the ground. They're going to cut down dividends, and they're going to take that risk capital and operating capital and invest it into renewable energies. Very interesting reaction from the market. As soon as Mr. Looney, the new CEO of British Petroleum, announced this, what did the capital markets do? 7% increase in the value of shares immediately, 24 hours later. So it's very interesting, despite the fact that they said we're going to cut down on dividends. And if there's one thing that oil and gas companies have never done, is cut down on dividends. And that's why so many people are invested in them, because they feel that that's a secure investment. No longer so. No longer so.
Yes, I'm just wondering, Christiana, I mean, given that you identified and Robert identified as well the gap between what government policy does at a federal or national level and what states do, and then what corporations do. There's also a gap, isn't there, in what the international markers have set and what individual countries or corporations do. There was criticism of Kyoto protocols, that they weren't rigorous enough and weren't ambitious enough, and similar criticism of Paris, that if everybody met their Paris targets, that still would not be enough to reduce emissions sufficiently in the period required to avoid some of the worst outcomes. It does raise the question of whether a market-driven approach and response is in fact more effective, Christiana.
Well, if anyone thinks that the Paris Agreement doesn't take us to climate neutrality, is because they haven't read the full Paris Agreement. So the logic that the Paris Agreement is built on is very much of a bottom-up logic, in which we invited every country to do their homework and, under consultation with all sectors, to come forward with their first tranche, first nationally determined contribution that would be effective for the first 5 years. But just like wine, that was just the first vintage. Then there is something called the ratchet mechanism that is inbuilt in the Paris Agreement, in which every 5 years, all countries come together to figure out how much that they actually decarbonize according, as compared to what they thought they would be able to do. How has technology improved? How has capital shifted? Robert already spoke about BlackRock and many other truly capital leading companies moving on capital shifting. And how has policy, so technology, capital, and policy, how has that all improved such that, and public expectation, such that countries will be able to take on every 5 years bigger and deeper ambition commitments, so that at the end we're actually moving toward and will reach a carbon neutrality of the global economy by 2050. So to say that the Paris Agreement has a target is simply not to understand the Paris Agreement. That was only the first contribution. And now the second contribution is due next year. It would have been due this year, but COP26 has been delayed to next year. So the second contribution is due next year. And governments are beginning to figure this out. Interestingly, what has actually overtaken the process of defining the next tranche or the next vintage of climate ambition is COVID, especially the economic recovery packages. And we know that we already have at least 12 trillion, possibly going up to $20 trillion of fresh capital. Not so fresh because it comes from borrowed money, but capital that is being injected into the economy. And because of the scale and the speed with which that capital is being injected over the next 18 months, that capital is going to define the characteristics of the global economy, not just for 1 year, but very likely for 10 or 20 or 30, which means it is the greenness or the sustainability component, the responsibility characteristics of those recovery packages that are going to define whether countries will be able to get on track with being at carbon neutrality by 2050 or not, because they have never injected as much capital, and they have never made such long-term commitments that are going to have the attendant greenhouse gas emissions over years. So, you know, we thought that that we had set up a system of increasing of ambition every 5 years, but lo and behold, COVID has taken over, and the economic recovery packages that will be deployed and invested over the next 18 months are probably going to be even more important than any political commitment that any government can make.
And Robert, that may in part answer this question as well. It was quite an interesting question that came in from one of the viewers here today, and to COP26, and with that delay, how do you maintain momentum, of course, given what we're dealing with currently in the world as well?
Well, I think there are forces at play during COVID that are slowing investment in renewables. Or if a company, for example, is feeling cash crunch, maybe they have to delay a decision that requires an investment, even if ultimately that's a more that has a good return on investment, say transition to renewables. There are also huge pressures on the oil industry, which are accelerating renewables. And we've seen some countries, we've seen the European Union essentially design their economic stimulus package around as a green stimulus package, that they're not drawing a distinction between what's economically sensible for their future and you know, the focus on renewables. They are completely aligned in their investment strategy. So I'm not sure so it's hard to see, it's hard to know how this will pan out overall in terms of the impact on climate. I think there are some places it will slow and others where it will accelerate. What we've seen, though, is that with climate change, these investments are going to become increasingly important. And ultimately, as the pandemic finishes, the climate impacts are just accelerating. So the public demand for greater action from government is going to be louder, and governments will listen ultimately. You know.
No, just finish, Robert. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, Stan, you mentioned is the private sector enough in this case? Well, currently with or government commitments enough. Currently, notwithstanding the an increased ambition in the next phase that of Paris that Christiana mentioned, currently if governments implement all of their commitments, the ones they've made, the climate will warm by possibly between 3 and 4 degrees, which
3.7, absolutely.
Which would be dreadful. And really, if it's approaching 3 and 4 degrees, our efforts to adapt to climate change will be overwhelmed by the scale of the hazards that we'll experience. So it's not that government isn't important. We have renewable energy making this transition. We've got the financial sector. We've got corporations. But governments can fundamentally accelerate all of this transition, and that's what needs to happen.
Robert, that does raise questions about Australia. Let's talk about Australia specifically for a little bit, and then we'll open back up to the rest of the world. But if we're looking at Australia's Paris commitments, by 2030, a reduction of 26 to 28% off 2005 levels. The UN believes that Australia is not on track to meet that. The government says that it still is. 2 questions to you on that. Do you believe that Australia is on track to meet the commitment? And even if it is that enough?
I think, let me answer that slightly indirectly, Stan. I think if you truly appreciate the impact climate change will have on Australia, and we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg now, to mix metaphors a bit, with the bushfires. As a sensible person, you would be now working all out to identify ways to encourage global action on mitigating climate change. And the focus on the target misses the point, I think. Because really it's a question of, are we doing everything we can do, given this huge impact it's going to have on our economy, on our people, in our region, and therefore on Australia? are we doing everything we can do? Are we advocating globally for a stronger ambition on climate change? If we're not doing that, and we're not really able to do that credibly with our current level of commitment, because externally that commitment looks very small, very weak. And so from my perspective, we should be doing everything we can to advocate globally, because we can't solve this problem in Australia, for greater climate action. And that means making bolder commitments and targets to reduce greenhouse gases in Australia as well.
Yeah, Christiana, you know, the 2020 Climate Change Performance Index was really sobering to read for Australia, because it put Australia as the worst performing country on climate change policy. From where you sit and what you observe of Australia, how are we tracking?
The way you just described.
The worst?
Well, I mean, especially if you consider what the option is. There are some countries that simply do not have other options for energy generation or for land use. Australia has everything at its doorstep. You have more sun than any other country. You have more wind. You have maritime energy. You have land use, land galore. I mean, honestly, Australia is the most blessed country with respect to all of the solutions to climate change. And as Robert already said, right, the territories and the states have actually already undertaken their target, because they know that they are competitive in this. Australia could perfectly well not only generate its own electricity with renewables, and you have the deepest penetration of residential solar panels in the world already. You have the biggest battery storage in the world already, but you could completely generate all your own energy in order to not have to burn anything that pollutes the air. But also, you could substitute the export of coal, which we know is reducing demand, international demand for coal is reducing day by day. And you could substitute the export of coal with hydrogen by using the extraordinary unlimited renewable energy power generation that you have, and producing green hydrogen for export as well as for internal consumption. So honestly, if you compare the alternative that Australia has, the options that it has for completely converting its economy to a completely clean economy, then yes, it is. I don't know if it's the worst country, but it certainly is way down at the bottom of the list.
But Robert, we know that coal is going to remain part of the energy mix, and coal is, if not the biggest, certainly one of the biggest export industries for Australia, and a big employer. There are those realities to confront, aren't there?
Absolutely. There are, you know, as with globalization, even if there's a net benefit, there are winners and losers. And the task of government is to first of all focus on what the national interest is over the longer term, and then to provide the support and the leadership to manage that transition. Australia is the largest exporter of coal by far. It exports more than twice what the second largest exporter, Indonesia, exports. And that is, so even if our own greenhouse gas emissions are relatively small as a nation, we have, how should I put this, a leadership opportunity by virtue of the fact that we're the largest exporter of coal in the world to address this issue. But there's pain, there's always pain in these things, but the pain will be enormously larger if the climate continues to warm, if those assets that we have currently are stranded assets in coal and fossil fuels. The transitional pain will be far worse if we don't act.
But that's a longer term view, and we deal with very short political cycles, Robert. And as we all know, that issue was decisive at the last election, particularly the result in Queensland, driven, you could say broadly, by issues like the Adani mine, and that became a real fault line. The question of where do we invest and maintaining jobs vis-a-vis longer term action on the climate. If there is a political return for maintaining investment in fossil fuel industries, isn't that what the politicians will do?
I think we're starting to see leadership from the government on this issue. We started seeing this after a bit of embarrassment following the bushfires. This was interrupted somewhat by COVID significantly, and that opportunity for leadership is going to reemerge in a big way, because we're going to continue to be inundated by these disasters of enormous scale. And the government is actually doing some great work on climate adaptation. In fact, in Australia, investments in adaptation have passed through Parliament with strong bipartisan support, whether it's the Disaster Response Fund or the Future Drought Fund. There may be described differently by the two parties, but they're generally supported because, of course, we're seeing the pain in Australian communities. Queensland, which is the most hazard-prone state in Australia, if you look at the 77 local government units, over something like 53 of them have now experienced 3 or more disasters in the last 3 years. That's unprecedented. It's unsustainable. These local government areas are now essentially permanently in the state of recovering from disasters. And it's the politics that triggers that will ultimately lead governments to act on this more enthusiastically and energetically, as we'll see with the outcomes of the Royal Commission.
Christiana, one of the debates in Australia too has been about not just our economy, but also the provision of cost-effective and reliable power. We've had some significant power outages, blackouts in Australia that have become very heated political issues. And once again, people who will say that this is a result of relying too much on renewables, and others will say that no, that wasn't a factor. But in that transition period that we talk about, where there are going to be winners and losers, there is going to be a change to our economies, and there is going to be a change in the energy mix. How do we deal with that period, and can we deal with that effectively in terms of providing reliable sources of energy that are not too expensive in the short term?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not, and no one is saying that this is easy. No one is saying that it's been done, because the fact is we are facing climate change as a global economy. We're only beginning to face it. So unfortunately, there are not, other than in the European Union, there are not that many examples that we can point to for a successful transition. But it is entirely possible. And in fact, the last study, I believe, of the AEMO in Australia shows all of the benefits that can be reaped by Australia in a transition over to renewable energy. So it is possible. I think for me, the most important piece is what is known as the just transition. And the just transition is the equity piece of this, especially a country that has as much dependence on coal, which means that there are many workers that are in coal. And in fact, their families have probably been in the coal mining business for generations, and they're not prepared to do anything else. And those families and those workers do need to be supported. Spain has done a brilliant job at closing their coal mines and their coal plants over a very careful period, and supporting the professional transition of those who were working in either a coal mine or a coal plant. So it is entirely doable. But you asked before, Stan, about Adani. And I do think that it is important to recognize that Adani company has already decided that they're actually going to reduce the impact of their supposed, and I use supposed because I don't think that they're eventually going to open the mine, but their plans now have been sizably brought down in terms of the size of the mine, because they could not find any Australian or international financing that was willing to put up that risk capital, knowing that that is a stranded asset. So they have to take it out of their own wallet. B, they have been under huge public opinion attack, and they are, of course, sensitive to that. But C, they can see that coal is going to be exported, or they are hoping for that export, and the country, or one of the countries that is going to absorb a lot of that coal is India. Now, interestingly enough, and again, I speak about the humor of the universe. There is one company that has been allotted the largest contract ever on solar generation, ever. By far the largest contract in India.
I know where you're going here.
What company is that? Adani. So, I mean, the universe, you have to laugh at the humor of the universe, right? Because the universe is sending a very clear message to Adani saying, this is your future. India is not going to import coal from Adani. They are actually going to produce solar energy with the support of Adani. So, I mean, these are just such very clear markers of a transition that is occurring. It is admittedly messy. I have never seen a transition that is a clean transition. It's a messy transition, but the direction of travel is very clear.
Robert, in terms of that transition, what are your thoughts? Because, you recall the debates here about some of the more spectacular power outages and blackouts we've had, particularly in places like South Australia, Victoria as well. What are your thoughts on that transition period, the costs and reliability of renewables? Because we know that can become such a lightning rod in Australia.
So I wasn't actually in the country at that time. I was in the UN, but just on the transition, I remember Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, commented that I think he was actually commenting on what others had said, but that we didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones, and we're not going to leave the fossil fuel age because we've run out of fossil fuels. It's just that there are better alternatives. There are cheaper, cleaner, better, more cost-efficient alternatives. So I think we're in the middle of an unprecedented global energy transformation. This has never happened at the pace that this is happening. And it's being driven fundamentally by profit, and there's probably, governments can say put a price on carbon, which would accelerate this dramatically, but the profit motive is enormously compelling. And if my optimism about the future is that this motivation will make this transition happen even faster than people realize today. Governments can accelerate that. There are teething problems. There's pain in a transition. Some sectors are losers, some are winners. We have sectors, anyway, there are winners and losers, but this transition is happening. It's going to happen quickly.
It's really interesting. You mentioned there, Robert, the idea of putting a price, that there is some push mechanism here. The IMF, Christiana, has said that carbon tax is the most effective way. If you want to be able to get emissions down quickly, there needs to be that push factor. What do you think? Do you agree with that? And we know again just how politically fraught anything to do with a cost impost is in any sort of political cycle. And it's been the third rail in Australia. It's cost prime ministers and opposition leaders their job in terms of how do you drive a political response to this. Is carbon tax the most effective way?
Well, I would say carbon price is the most effective possible. And there are different ways of reaching a carbon price and carbon price visibility. One is definitely taxing. And there are at least 20 jurisdictions around the world that have a carbon tax, including my own country. Other jurisdictions have actually decided not to tax, but to engage in an emissions trading system, which also in the end delivers a carbon price. So either way, whichever way you choose, and that has to be the choice of each economy in each jurisdiction, I do think that the simplest, most effective way of accelerating decarbonization is to put a price on carbon. Now, we are probably not going to have a global price on carbon in the near future, because that is the one big chunk that was left over and not agreed to in 2015 in Paris, and still hasn't been agreed to. It's been sort of hanging there, is an international price on carbon and international trading of carbon. So I don't think, given the politics that we have around that, I don't think that we're going to have that in the near future. Interestingly, however, because economics are increasingly on our side, as Robert has already mentioned, because the cost of renewable energy generation and of materials going in to renewable energy is bottoming out so quickly, a cost on carbon, a price on carbon would accelerate, but is no longer absolutely necessary for the transition, at least for the bottom of the cost curve energies, right? For some policy measures and some technologies such as carbon capture and storage, we probably will need a price on carbon, because it's going to be very difficult to do it without that. But certainly for renewable energy, you do no longer, certainly not for solar, certainly not for offshore wind. In fact, in many countries, not even onshore wind, we don't need a price of carbon anymore. We could have probably reached 25% of renewable energy on the global grid, which is where we are now. We could have reached that quicker had we had a price on carbon, but now we're there. And it is absolutely clear that the price of renewable energies has never been as high as it is right now, because it will only continue to descend because of the rise in volume and because of the increasing investments into those technologies. So economics are on our side for the lower cost, the bottom part of the cost curve. We don't need a price on carbon. For the much more expensive measures, yes, we will need a price on carbon.
Where do you sit on that, Robert? And you know, it's, as we said before, it's been such a political. It's the third rail in Australia, isn't it? You know, carbon tax emissions trading scheme. It's been such heavily contested political space.
Yeah, it's ironic because I know earlier Australia actually had a scheme, a carbon, essentially to put a price on carbon. So there was actually, we were actually positioned quite early in the discussion about this. I think the real question is what is the most efficient economically way of reducing greenhouse gases as rapidly as possible, and the answer to that depends on the individual project, the sector, the country, the context. So the only thing I can say about this is that over time, the business case will become stronger and stronger. It'll become stronger because the price of renewables is dropping. The price of solar will, according to some recent research, reduce by half again in something like 5 years. It's already competitive with new coal. And in Australia and many other markets, it's competitive with new solar is competitive with existing coal power plants. So that business case will become stronger and stronger. I think it would still be good to put a price on carbon because there's still many places we're doing that. As Christiana said, carbon capture and storage is an example, but many individual and national contexts where that will accelerate the transition. And, you know, one of the other distinctions between COVID and climate is that there is a solution to COVID. There is a permanent solution to COVID with a vaccine or with herd immunity. The problem goes away. It becomes like another seasonal flu in effect. With climate change, we reach a point, if we reach a point where polar caps, ice caps are melting, it will be a millennium of damage and impact. In human timescales, it's in effect irreparable, irreversible. It's not like pollution from cars. When the air quality gets bad, we can put catalytic converters on cars and the air will clear up. There's enormous momentum and inertia in the climate system, which means that even if we stopped everything, all greenhouse gases globally tomorrow morning, the climate would continue to warm for decades. So this creates the urgency for acting now before the worst impacts are visible. And putting a price on carbon will help accelerate that transition.
Christiana, we did have someone point out, one of our viewers point out earlier, that there is a vaccine for climate change, and that is to reduce emissions. So that's what.
Well put.
And anti-vaxxers who are climate change deniers too, we might add.
But you know, we have to do two things. We have to reduce emissions, but we also have to regenerate ecosystems. We can't just reduce emissions on the energy side. We have to regenerate ecosystems, because otherwise we will not be able to stabilize the planet, and we certainly will not be able to feed everyone. So both. So maybe we need two vaccines.
Two vaccines. Christiana, we mentioned the United States a lot, and we touched on China, and I just want to get your thoughts on where you see China at the moment. You mentioned China and India investing in renewables, solar and wind, and that is true. China is also still the world's biggest emitter, and there have been some concerns in recent times that as China's economy starts to slow down, the impact of the trade war, the impact of COVID, that there may be losing momentum or a swing back to coal. We still know that much of China is dealing with enormous issues of smog, as is India. I know from my time living there, the toxicity of the environment, the pollution of the rivers, the illnesses that you see, the respiratory illnesses that you see are still so apparent there. Where do you see China positioned right now, given all of those factors and the fact that geopolitically we are at a bit of a hinge point?
Yeah, a little bit. It's not a black and white situation. China continues to use coal for a sizable portion of its generation. Now, if you look historically, they're actually reaching peak coal, which means they are not increasing more than historically. So they're beginning to bend the curve now that everybody's concerned about bending the curve on COVID. Now we finally understand what bending the curve means. Climate people have been talking about bending the curve for years, but now we finally viscerally understand that. So China is beginning to bend the curve on coal and domestically. And doing that for several reasons. A, because they know that it is economically no longer competitive. B, because even in China, there is quite a bit of public pushback against the pollution that is caused by coal and by the other fossil fuel industries. And C, because they really are looking far ahead, as China can, beyond 4 years political cycle like the United States is forced to do. China can look much farther down the line and see that their competitive edge in what they call the ecological civilization, which they want to lead in the 21st century, their competitive edge is precisely the investments that they're making into all of these clean technologies. Now, all of that is good news. Bad news is that China continues to invest in coal in many Asian countries. And part of the reason why they're doing that is because they do have a coal industry, and because the door is closing to the coal industry domestically, they are supporting their own coal industry internationally. So that is really bad news. Now, I recently talked to Client Earth CEO, James Thornton, who told us on our podcast, so publicly told us, that the Chinese officials have actually asked for training on how to do a traffic light system for the investments of the Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative is the biggest investment project ever. And China is investing everywhere, in every country, into infrastructure. And apparently they're setting up this traffic light system according to which they are going to give either green, yellow, or red to investments according to the environmental consequences of those investments. That is a huge turnaround for China. If that actually begins to play out, go beyond the training that they're receiving now, and it's actually going to influence investment decisions, that's going to be huge. That is going to be absolutely huge for China. Now, the third piece that I wanted to say is, I think with respect to geopolitics on climate change and on other issues, China is waiting for Godot. And Godot is the 3rd of November. They are really waiting to see who are they going to deal with over the next 4 years in the United States. I remember so clearly how the United States and China were so collaborative. They signed 4 bilateral agreements before the Paris Agreement because they had realized that together they can do much more than individually or in parallel to each other. That didn't mean that they were in bed about all other issues. They still had many, many differences on trade and on many other issues, but they were walking hand in hand on climate change. I don't think that that is a scenario that is beyond beyond possibility again next year should the White House change hands. I actually suspect that there is enough benefit for their own population as well as for their economy and their export potential. There's enough benefit of decarbonizing their own economy and certainly their investments abroad that they would be willing to work hand in hand with the United States should there be a change in the White House.
Robert, can I get your thoughts on, we know that China is rapidly, and China's rise is rapidly changing the defence and strategic posture of all nations around the world. And we saw recently Australia release its defence strategy update, significant increase in spending, and no doubt, even though they're not explicit about it, the government, no doubt that is driven by these increasing tensions. And the prospect of conflict in the Indo-Pacific now is considered a possibility. And Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said that we live in a poorer, more dangerous and more disordered world. How do you factor climate change into that equation, the hazards that would bring, the increasing geostrategic competition, the maritime disputes that we've seen in places like the South China Sea, the East China Sea and other places, the border disputes that we've seen with India and China. How do you see all of this playing into, and climate change playing into this much more volatile geopolitical and strategic environment?
I think, people often describe climate change as a threat multiplier. And I think that hopelessly understates the role climate change will have on security, both in our region and globally. Climate change is a global systemic change. So, and much of the science, sorry, this is a roundabout answer to your question, Stan. Much of the science about climate change in the IPCC treats hazards as if they are independent variables. So they might look at what impact does temperature rise have on agriculture. But with a systemic change, it's not just temperature rise, it's bushfires, it's population displacement, it's tsunamis that destroy, that have bigger impact because coral reefs have died. It's foods insecurity, it's new pests, it's the movement of predators of those pests. So all of those factors are happening simultaneously with climate change, and they're not happening once a year, they're happening all the time. That's the change that's happening. And so if we look at the impacts that has on security, they're enormous, and they're very difficult to analyze because there are so many things happening simultaneously. And we're seeing this in Australia and our own hazards. If you look at the South China Sea, fish species are moving to the poles as a result of warming temperature. That already means that the traditional patterns of fishing and the disputes over fishing will evolve. Angus Campbell, our chief of the Defense Forces, recently gave a talk in which he highlighted the South China Sea and climate change, or at least he's reported as having said this. It wasn't actually a transcript. The South China Seas will be, that's a risk in future, an increasing risk. But that applies to the water scarcity and what impact that could have on borders and on shared watersheds in places like South Asia. The politics with China will be enormous in that China and India, between China and other countries in the region, and between Australia and the United States as well. So I think it's really difficult both to quantify, but also to overstate the impact this will have in the decades ahead.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I just want to touch on a couple of things, a bit of a rapid fire round, if you like, from both of you. But a question to both of you, and this is put often, Christiana, why not the nuclear option if you're talking about safe, if you're not safe, that's actually disputed, but the question's about clean energy. Nuclear is always put forward as an option. I remember what happened in Japan, which of course was relying a lot on nuclear after the tsunami, and how the debate swung back there. But how do you see that, the nuclear option, which is often put forward as one of the alternatives?
Yeah, I think that is very much, I think that's very much of a national decision. Whether a country, X, India, France, whichever country, can actually afford nuclear in its fourth generation, which is the safest technology that we have. I don't think it's responsible to build anything with less safety. I think any new nuclear will have to go to the top safety, which is fourth generation. And ultimately, this is going to be a question of cost. Which countries can actually afford to do that versus renewable energies to, I almost feel like a broken record here now with Robert also, renewable energies continuing to drop in cost. The fact is that nuclear will always be more and more expensive because of the security and safety issues. It will become more and more expensive, and renewables will become more and more affordable. And so those two cost curves are going in exactly the opposite directions. And the fact is that with concentrated solar power, you can already reach grid scale and certainly and in fact nuclear scale generation levels. So ultimately, I think it's going to depend on national decisions about what they can afford to invest in their energy generation, and how risky or what tolerance they have for the risk in energy generation.
Robert, where do you sit on the question of nuclear?
Well, when I was in the UN, I visited Japan frequently, both to look at the rebuilding after the Great Eastern Japan earthquake. And I can just say that the impact that hazard had on Fukushima and the province, the nuclear reactor, was just enormous, and really left a very deep impression on me about the risks of nuclear energy. Similarly, there are stories emerging actually this week in the news that the fires, which in Siberia, in Russia rather, that are linked to climate change, are now affecting areas of linked to Chernobyl and releasing radiation. This is decades after Chernobyl. So I think in addition to what Christiana said about the competitiveness, the cost competitiveness, which is a fundamental issue, there are these lingering issues of safety. They're not just lingering, they're present in many places. even decades after. I know there have been there's a lot of research underway at laboratories around the world to develop inherently safe reactors and to get the costs down. But I think there's some fundamental challenges, and most fundamentally is the cost competitiveness relative to alternatives.
We're almost out of time, but Christiana, you have said before, and you've written this in your books and other articles, that we are on borrowed time, that we are sleepwalking, that this is a lost decade. Do you still feel that way, or is there more optimism in your view now? Do you think that the moment that we're experiencing that's accelerating so many other issues may also accelerate more cooperation and consensus?
Yeah, definitely, Stan. I don't think this is a lost decade. I think this is the decisive decade. Mm-hmm. This is a decade in which we consciously or unconsciously are deciding not just our own future, but the future of generations to come. That's no hyperbole. That is scientific fact. Because by the end of this decade, we have to, in order to get on track with climate change, we have to be at 1/2 the global emissions that we have today by 2030. So this is the decade, right? If there ever was pressure on us to take advantage of the most amazing opportunity that humanity has ever been afforded, this is it. This is it. And if we don't do that, we will be moving into a world of constant destruction. But if we do, we will build a world that is safer, that is more stable, that is more healthy, on and on and on. So many benefits to be had from a decarbonized economy.
We had a terrific question earlier on, and I wanted to try to finish with this as a way of being able to add some value for the people who've tuned in today as well. And that was, what would you, if you could choose 3 things for both of you that you could direct people to further engage with this? Think tanks, articles, books, people who may be worthwhile investing your time with to read about or to follow. 3 things that you would suggest here, Christiana, that would be useful for people to follow up this conversation we've had today.
Do you want me go first or Robert?
Yeah. If you go first, then we'll finish with Robert.
Well, you know, I would like to start at the individual level, because honestly, whatever we don't do individually, it's very hard to expect others to do. So at the individual level, point number 1, figure out what your carbon footprint is. Not very difficult to do. You can go into Miss Google, you type carbon calculator, and up pops a long list of institutions, all of whom have very credible carbon calculators. Choose whichever institution you love best and figure out what your carbon footprint, what yours is, what your family's is, what your company, your city, whatever level of the system you want to work at. So first, understand how you are contributing to the problem. Don't blame yourself, because we all have a carbon footprint. Just take it as the starting line, the base point. And then point number 2, figure out how you're going to halve those emissions over the next 10 years at the latest. Honestly, we should all be able to do that over 5 years, not over 10. But you can make a plan to figure out how to halve those emissions. And my point number 3 is become a responsible citizen around climate change and talk to your neighbors and friends. Make it a sticky thing. Make it such that, you know, it is a conversation that you can have. It should be, frankly, it should be a fun conversation. Wow, what have you done? What can I do? What can we do together? The ability and the opportunity to create a new world, and this is no exaggeration again, we have it in our hands right now, the ability and the opportunity to create a very different world. We cannot walk away from that, and we cannot pretend like it's not here. So grab that opportunity by the horns, and together we can build a much, much better future.
Robert, your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure I can improve on that, Christiana. That was wonderful. If people are looking for sources of information, is that what the way?
Yeah, part of that, yeah. Sources or articles or
I guess Christiana's talked about the individual level. At a global level, understand what climate change means, and the most authoritative source of information is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reflects the scientific consensus. So understand the science, understand what climate change means for you, and there are sources of information about that available, including the impacts in Australia from the bushfires. In Australia, I'd recommend the submissions to the Bushfire Royal Commission and also the final report when the Royal Commission issues its report in about 3 months' time. But there are a number of credible sources about the impacts, local impacts of climate, because those are things people need to start responding to now, including where if they're buying a house, where is the house, what threats is it exposed to? And then find ways of becoming involved in the politics, in the action. Support, there are very different views. This is not, as Christiana mentioned, this is not an issue of, is climate change real or isn't it? This is a question, you might have be a part of a different political party. The question should be, what's the best response? And there can be legitimate, intelligent debate about investments, how to invest and what to do. So find those opportunities to engage and make a difference in this issue, which is fundamentally the most significant challenge of our day.
Well, you've certainly made a difference today. It's really been fantastic to just spend this time with both of you and have a conversation that we don't get to often have, and at length to work through the myriad issues of the economic, the political, the environmental, the social, and to be able to engage with this in such a constructive way. It's been a real pleasure. I hope everyone's enjoyed it, and I hope we've reflected a lot of the issues that people have written in about today as well. Thank you so much for both of you for your time.
See you again, Robert.
Yeah, nice to see you. Bye-bye.